If you fly over central Iowa at 10,000 feet in July, the land looks like a table, a green table, impossibly flat, stretched to the horizon in every direction, divided into mile-square sections, by roads and half-mile rectangles, by fences that mostly aren't there anymore. From the air, the landscape is continuous. Corn and soybeans and corn, the two crops alternating in a mosaic of green that covers every acre of ground that a plow can reach. There are no interruptions, no edges, no borders between one field and the next, just crop. From one road to another, from one property line to the next, unbroken by anything vertical, except the occasional grain elevator punching up from a small town like a tooth in a smooth jaw. It wasn't always this way. If you could fly over the same ground in 1950, you'd see something different. The same flat table, the same corn and soybeans, but interrupted every quarter mile by dark lines running north-south and east-west across the landscape. Tree lines, shelter belts, rows of Osage orange and red cedar and cottonwood and box elder planted along every fence row, every property boundary, every road right-of-way. The trees had been planted in the 1930s, most of them, during the Dust Bowl years when the government paid farmers to plant windbreaks because the wind was taking the soil and the soil was the only thing between a farmer and starvation. The trees grew, the soil stayed, the crisis passed, and the trees remained, dark lines on the landscape, living fences that broke the wind and held the snow and sheltered the pheasants and marked the boundaries between one man's ground and the next. Then the trees came down. It happened slowly at first, then all at once, the way most changes happen in farm country. In the 1970s, tractors got bigger. The 12-row planter replaced the 6-row. The 30-foot combine header replaced the 15-foot. The machines needed room. The fence rows that had guided horse-drawn equipment at 5 miles per hour were obstacles to 24-row planters running at 8. A tree line along a quarter-mile boundary took up a strip of ground 20 to 30 feet wide, an acre per quarter mile. 4 tree lines on a 160-acre field consumed 4 to 6 acres. At $600 per acre of corn revenue, those tree lines were costing $2,400 to $3,600 per field per year in lost production. The math was simple. The chainsaws came out. Between 1975 and 2000, Marshall County, Iowa, lost approximately 85% of its shelter belts. The tree lines that had defined the landscape since the 1930s were cut, bulldozed, burned, and plowed under. The stumps were pulled with excavators. The roots were ripped with V-blades. The ground was leveled, tiled, and planted. Where there had been dark lines of Osage orange and cedar, there was now corn. Where there had been windbreaks, there was now open field. Uninterrupted, from road to road, fence to fence, the flat green table that you see today from 10,000 feet. Everybody cleared their trees. Everybody except one farmer who wouldn't touch his. His name was Nolan Sabetka. He farmed 400 acres in the western half of the county, land that had been in the Sabetka family since 1918. When his grandfather, Joseph, a Czech immigrant from South Bohemia, had bought the first 160 acres with money he'd saved working in the coal mines of southern Iowa. Joseph had planted the shelter belts himself in 1936. The year the Soil Conservation Service came through Marshall County, handing out seedlings and showing farmers how to plant windbreaks that would keep their topsoil from blowing to Nebraska. Joseph had planted 4 rows, 2 rows of red cedar on the outside, 2 rows of Osage orange on the inside, along every boundary of the original 160 acres. The rows were 20 feet wide and ran a total of approximately 2 miles around the perimeter. Joseph's son, Frank, had extended the shelter belts when he bought the adjacent 240 acres in 1952, planting the same 4-row pattern along the new boundaries. By the time Nolan took over in 1982, the Sabetka farm had approximately 4 miles of mature shelter belt, a continuous windbreak surrounding every field on the property, the trees 40 to 60 feet tall, the Osage orange trunks as thick as a man's waist, the red cedars dense and green year-round. The shelter belts consumed approximately 18 acres of Nolan's 400. Land that could have been planted to corn at $600 per acre. The co-op math was loud and constant. 18 acres times $600 equals $10,800 per year that Nolan was leaving in the trees. The co-op crowd did the math every spring when Nolan's planter went around the tree lines instead of through them, and they did the math again every fall when Nolan's combine went around the tree lines, and the extra passes cost time and fuel. Nolan Sabetka's farming around $10,000 worth of firewood, said Dale Novak, who farmed 800 acres to Nolan's east and who had cleared every tree on his property in 1983 with a D6 Caterpillar he'd rented for a weekend. Dale had gained 22 acres of cropland from the clearing, $13,200 per year in corn revenue. The D6 rental had cost $1,800. The clearing had paid for itself in 7 weeks. Joseph Sabetka planted those trees during the Dust Bowl, Dale told the Saturday crowd at the co-op. The Dust Bowl was 90 years ago. We're not in the Dust Bowl anymore. We've got no-till. We've got residue management. We've got GPS planters that put the seed in the ground without turning the soil. The wind doesn't matter anymore. The trees are a monument to a problem we solved 50 years ago. But Nolan won't cut them because his grandfather planted them, and God help any Sabetka who touches his grandfather's trees. The grandfather line was the one that stuck. It was the dismissal that reduced Nolan's decision from a land management choice to a sentimental weakness. The farmer who couldn't cut trees because his grandfather's ghost would disapprove. The co-op used it every season. Nolan farming around his grandfather's trees again. $10,000 a year in sentimentality. Somebody ought to buy that farm and clear it. Double the productivity in one weekend. Nolan heard it. He always heard it. Farm country doesn't have secrets. It is delayed broadcasts. The thing said at the co-op on Saturday morning reaches the subject by Saturday afternoon, carried by the neighbor who heard it and can't quite keep it to himself. Nolan heard it all. He never responded. Not at the co-op, not at the elevator, not to Dale Novak's face, not to anyone. He farmed his 400 acres the way his father had farmed them, and his grandfather had farmed them. Corn and beans in rotation, the shelter belts maintained, the dead cedars replaced, the Osage orange pruned when it grew too wide, the tree line clean and continuous from one end of the property to the other. This is the story of Nolan Sabetka and the trees that everyone wanted him to cut. It starts with a sound that nobody in Marshall County had heard before, and that everyone who survived it will hear in their dreams for the rest of their lives. But first, Let me tell you what the trees were doing while everyone was laughing at them. Because the shelter belts on Nolan's farm weren't just standing there taking up space, they were working. They'd been working since 1936. And the work they did was invisible from the co-op counter, but measurable from the field. A shelter belt breaks wind. That's its primary function. The 4 rows of trees create a barrier that reduces wind speed on the downwind side of the belt for a distance of approximately 10 to 15 times the height of the trees. Nolan's trees were 50 feet tall on average. The protected zone extended approximately 500 to 750 feet downwind, roughly 10 to 15 acres per quarter-mile row. At the edges of the protected zone, the wind speed was 50% of the open field speed. At the base of the trees, it was 10%. The wind didn't stop. It was redirected over and around the belt, losing energy as it went. On the other side of the trees, the air was calmer. The crop experienced less wind stress. The soil experienced less drying. The moisture stayed longer, and the moisture was the hidden number that the co-op math never included. Nolan had been testing his soil moisture since 1988, when the Extension Service had given him a set of gypsum blocks, buried sensors that measured the water content at root depth. He had blocks in the sheltered zone, within 500 feet of the trees, and blocks in the open zone, beyond 750 feet. He read them every 2 weeks during the growing season and recorded the numbers in the same farm journal his father had started in 1954. The data, accumulated over 22 years of readings, told a story that the co-op crowd never heard. The sheltered zone held an average of 1.2 inches more soil moisture than the open zone during July and August, the critical pollination period for corn. The trees weren't just blocking wind, they were trapping moisture. The reduced wind speed meant less evaporation from the soil surface and less transpiration stress on the crop. The corn in the sheltered zone had more water available during the 2 weeks that determined whether the ears would fill or abort. More water meant more kernels. More kernels meant more yield. Nolan had done the math. His math, not the co-op's. The sheltered corn averaged 12 bushels per acre, more than the open corn on the same farm, in the same hybrid, in the same year. 12 bushels at $4 per bushel was $48 per acre. The sheltered zone covered approximately 280 of his 400 acres. 280 acres times $48 equaled $13,440 per year in yield advantage from the moisture protection. The trees consumed 18 acres at $600 per acre, a cost of $10,800. The net benefit of keeping the trees, $2,640 per year. Positive, not a fortune, but positive. The trees were paying for themselves, and then some, in moisture, in yield, in the invisible work that wind protection does in a cornfield during a dry July. Nolan didn't share this math with the co-op. He didn't argue. He didn't publish. He didn't defend. He was a Sabetka, and Sabetkas farmed their ground and let the ground do the talking. The ground had been talking for 22 years. Nobody was listening except Nolan and his gypsum blocks and his farm journal. Now let me tell you about August 10th, 2020, because on that day the ground screamed. A derecho is a word most people in Iowa had never heard before August 10th, 2020, and will never forget after it. The word comes from the Spanish for straight. Derecho, a straight-line wind event, as opposed to a tornado, which rotates. A tornado is a scalpel. It cuts a narrow path of destruction a few hundred yards wide. A derecho is a steamroller. It flattens everything across a front that can stretch for hundreds of miles. The derecho of August 10th, 2020, formed in South Dakota in the morning and crossed Iowa in the afternoon. It traveled approximately 770 miles in 14 hours from the Nebraska border to Ohio. The wind speeds at the surface, not at altitude, at the surface, at crop level, at the height where corn plants stand 8 feet tall and weigh 2 pounds each and are designed to withstand wind up to about 40 miles per hour, reached 140 miles per hour in the strongest gusts, 140 miles per hour. The threshold for a Category 4 hurricane is 130. The derecho was, for a few terrible minutes, stronger than a major hurricane, and it was running across the most productive agricultural landscape on Earth at the speed of a freight train. The corn was at the worst possible stage, late dent, the ears fully formed, the stalks heavy with grain, the plants top-heavy and vulnerable to lodging. The wind hit the corn, and the corn went down. Not some of it, not most of it, all of it. Across a swath 40 miles wide and 400 miles long, the corn that had been standing at 8 feet was lying at 0, flattened, snapped, broken at the base, broken at the ear node, bent over and tangled in the rows like soldiers fallen in formation. The sound, described by farmers who were in their fields when it hit, was not a roar. It was a hiss. The hiss of millions of corn stalks breaking simultaneously, a sound like tearing fabric, amplified to the volume of a jet engine. Marshall County was in the center of the path. The derecho crossed the county from west to east in approximately 45 minutes, sustaining wind speeds above 100 miles per hour for the entire transit. Every field in the county was exposed. Every corn plant in the county was hit. The damage assessment, conducted by Iowa State University Extension, over the following weeks, estimated that 97% of the corn acreage in Marshall County was damaged. 97%. The average yield loss was estimated at 40 to 60%. On some farms, the loss was total. The corn was flat on the ground, unharvesting. The ears in the mud, the stalks broken beyond any combine's ability to pick them up. Dale Novak's 800 acres were flattened. Every stalk, every row, the corn lay pointing southeast, the direction the wind had pushed it, in a continuous mat of broken vegetation that looked from the road like a green carpet had been rolled out across the landscape. Dale walked into his field the day after the derecho and couldn't find a single standing stalk. His combine, a $400,000 John Deere 7.8. With a corn header designed for standing corn, would have to be refitted with a special head for picking up lodged crop. A $28,000 attachment that the dealer didn't have in stock and that every farmer in Iowa was trying to order simultaneously. Dale's estimated loss, $280,000 in crop revenue, plus $28,000 for the attachment, plus the additional fuel and time for harvesting flat corn at half the normal speed. The farms to Nolan's north, south, and east were the same. Flat corn, broken stalks. The July promise of 200 bushel yields turned into the August reality of 80 bushel salvage. The county was devastated. The governor declared a disaster. The insurance adjusters descended like locusts, their white trucks parked in every field approach, their clipboards full of numbers that meant ruin. Then the insurance adjuster drove to Nolan Sebetka's farm, and he saw something that made him stop his truck and get out and stand at the field edge and stare. Nolan's corn was standing. Not all of it. The outer 200 feet on the west side, the side the wind hit first, the unprotected margin beyond the shelter belt's reach, was down. Flat, like every other field in the county. But inside the sheltered zone, the 280 acres protected by 4 miles of 50-foot-tall red cedar and Osage orange, the corn was standing, leaning, stressed, some of it bent at 30 degrees from vertical, but standing. The stalks hadn't snapped, because the wind speed inside the sheltered zone had been 50 to 60% of the open field speed. 70 miles per hour instead of 140. 70 miles per hour is brutal. 70 bends corn, pushes it, tests every cell in the stalk. But 70 doesn't snap what 140 breaks. The difference between 70 and 140 is the difference between a corn plant leaning and a corn plant dead on the ground. The insurance adjuster's name was Tim Brockway. He'd been adjusting crop claims in central Iowa for 11 years. In the 2 weeks since the Derecho, he'd inspected 43 farms. Everyone was flattened, 97% damage, consistent with the county average. Tim had stopped expecting to find standing corn in Marshall County, after August 10th was like finding a dry spot in a lake. Tim walked into Nolan's sheltered corn. The plants were bent, 20 to 30 degrees from vertical, leaning southeast with the wind's memory still in them. But the stalks were intact. The ears were on the plant. The root systems hadn't pulled out of the ground. The corn was harvestable with a standard corn head at a standard speed. No specialty attachment. No half-speed salvage harvest. Standard combine. Standard header. Standard yield. Tim measured. He pulled ear counts, kernel counts, estimated the yield based on the plant population and the ear size. His estimate, 100 to 74 bushels per acre in the sheltered zone. The county average for the Derecho year, after damage, was projected at 118. Nolan's sheltered corn was 56 bushels, above the county damage average, a difference of $224 per acre at the 2020 corn price of $4. On 280 sheltered acres, $62,720 more than the county average. Tim drove back to his office and filed the claim. The report noted, Sebetka property shows significantly reduced wind damage in areas protected by mature shelter belt plantings. Estimated 65% damage reduction compared to adjacent unprotected fields. It was the only claim Tim filed that summer with the word reduced instead of total. Now let me tell you about the week after the Derecho, because the reaction in Marshall County was the kind of reckoning that happens when a community realizes, all at once, that the man they'd been mocking for 38 years had been right the entire time. The Derecho damage was visible from the road. Every road. You could drive any county road in Marshall County and see flat corn on both sides, a continuous mat of broken stalks stretching to the horizon. You could drive that same road past Nolan Sebetka's farm and see the tree line rise up from the landscape, and behind the tree line, corn that was bent but standing. The contrast was visible at 55 miles per hour. You didn't need to stop. You didn't need to walk the field. You could see it from the car. Standing corn behind the trees, flat corn everywhere else. People stopped. Not one or two, dozens. Neighbors, strangers, extension agents, insurance adjusters, reporters. They parked on the road's shoulder and looked at the tree line and the standing corn behind it. And they understood. Something that the co-op math had never accounted for. The trees weren't costing $10,800 per year in lost acreage. The trees were insurance. Insurance against a wind event that nobody had predicted, that nobody had planned for, that arrived once in 40 years and destroyed everything that wasn't protected. $10,800 per year in lost acreage over 38 years. $410,400 total. The yield protection in the Derecho year alone, $62,720 in direct crop value, plus the avoided cost of the specialty harvest attachment, $28,000, plus the avoided yield loss that the flattened corn would have cost without the shelter belt, approximately $140,000 on 280 acres at 60% loss. The total avoided cost in the Derecho year, approximately $230,000. $230,000 saved in one day against $410,000 spent over 38 years. On a pure dollar basis, the trees hadn't paid for themselves yet. But the Derecho wasn't the only wind event in 38 years. Every windstorm, every dry July, every winter where the shelter belts held, snow that became spring moisture. All of those events had been quietly adding value that the co-op math had been quietly ignoring. The 12 bushel per acre moisture advantage compounded over 38 years on 280 acres at an average corn price of $3.50, approximately $448,000 in total yield protection. The trees had been paying for themselves every year. The Derecho simply made the payment visible. Dale Novak drove to Nolan's farm on a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks after the Derecho. He parked in the driveway. He didn't get out immediately. He sat in his truck the way Lyle Becker had sat in his truck at Vernon Cohen's farm. The way every man sits when he's about to say something that costs him more than money. Nolan was in the barn, sharpening a chain on his saw. One of the cedars had lost a limb in the Derecho and needed trimming. The tree had survived 140-mile-per-hour wind with one broken limb. The corn behind it had survived with bent stalks and full ears. The cedar would heal. The corn would harvest. The system worked. Dale walked into the barn. "Nolan, Dale, your corn is standing. Most of it. Mine's flat. Every stalk. 800 acres on the ground. I'm looking at maybe 80 bushels where I had 200. I'm going to lose $300,000 this year." Nolan set down the chain file. He looked at Dale, the man who'd been loudest at the co-op, the man who'd rented the D6 in 1983 and cleared 22 acres of trees in a weekend, the man who'd done the math on Nolan's $10,800 of lost acreage every spring for 38 years. Dale was 68 years old. He looked older. The Derecho had aged him the way catastrophic loss ages a farmer. Not in the body, but in the eyes that looked at 800 acres of flat corn and saw $300,000 gone. "I cleared my trees in '83, Dale said. 22 acres, $13,200 a year in extra corn. 38 years. I made about $500,000 from those 22 acres. He paused. I just lost $300,000 in one afternoon because there was nothing between my corn and 140-mile-an-hour wind. Nolan didn't do the arithmetic out loud. Dale was doing it himself, and the arithmetic was brutal. $500,000 earned from clearing trees over 38 years, minus $300,000 lost in one day because the trees weren't there. Net gain from clearing, $200,000. It sounded like a profit until you compared it to Nolan's math. $410,000 in lost acreage over 38 years, offset by $448,000 in moisture-protected yield over the same period, plus $230,000 in avoided loss from the Derecho. Nolan's net from keeping the trees, approximately $268,000, better than Dale's net from cutting them. The trees had won, not by a little, by $268,000. Your grandfather planted those trees, Dale said. In 1936, he'd been in Iowa for 18 years. He'd seen the dirt blow. He'd seen what open ground does when the wind comes. He planted 4 rows because the Soil Conservation Service said 3 was minimum, and Joseph Sabetka never did minimum on anything. I used to say you kept the trees because of your grandfather. I heard. I was wrong. You kept the trees because of the wind. I kept the trees because of everything. The wind, the moisture, the snow, the pheasants. The fact that my grandfather walked this ground and decided that the most important thing he could plant wasn't corn, it was the thing that protected corn. Corn lasts one season. A tree lasts a century. My grandfather thought in centuries. The co-op thinks in seasons. The difference between those two time scales is the difference between my corn standing and yours on the ground. Dale stood in the barn for a long time. He didn't leave quickly the way dealers leave, with a handshake and a drive home. He stood and looked at the saw and the chain and the cedar limb on the workbench, and he thought about the D6 Caterpillar he'd rented in 1983 and the 22 acres of trees he'd pushed into a pile and burned and plowed under and planted to corn and celebrated at the co-op as progress. If I planted trees today, Dale said, how long before they'd protect my corn? Depends on the species. Cedar takes 15 years to reach functional height. Osage orange takes 20. If you planted tomorrow, your grandchildren would have the windbreak your grandfather should have kept. My grandchildren. Trees are a gift to the future. My grandfather's gift is standing in my fence rows right now, 84 years old, protecting corn he never imagined and surviving wind he never predicted. Your gift, the trees you don't plant today, is the absence that your grandchildren will farm inside. They'll farm open ground with nothing between their crop and whatever the sky sends. That's your gift to them, open ground. Dale drove home. Nolan went back to sharpening the chain. They didn't speak about it again, but the following spring, Dale Novak ordered 600 red cedar seedlings from the state nursery and planted them in 2 rows along the west boundary of his property, a half-mile shelter belt, 20 feet wide, consuming 1 acre of cropland. 1 acre out of 800, $600 per year in lost corn. The beginning of a windbreak that wouldn't reach functional height until 2035 and wouldn't match the protection of Nolan's 84-year-old trees until 2055. Dale didn't tell anyone at the co-op. He planted the trees on a Saturday morning when nobody was watching. But by the following week, the seedlings were visible from the road. 600 small green points in a straight line along the fence row, where Dale had cleared the old trees 38 years earlier. The co-op noticed. The co-op always notices. Dale Novak's planting trees. After the Derecho, same fence row he cleared in '83. Took him 38 years to put back what he took out in a weekend. Nobody laughed. The Derecho had cured the county of laughing at trees. Now, let me tell you about what happened across the county, because Dale wasn't the only one who planted. The Iowa Department of Natural Resources reported a 340% increase in shelter belt seedling orders from Marshall County in 2021 compared to the previous 5-year average, 340%. 14 farms in the county planted new shelter belts that spring, ranging from Dale's modest half-mile to 2 operations that planted full perimeter belts around their primary fields. The USDA's Environmental Quality Incentives Program provided cost-share funding for the plantings, $1.50 per seedling, $200 per acre of established shelter belt. And the Extension Service cited the Sabetka Farm as the primary demonstration site for shelter belt effectiveness against straight-line wind. Iowa State University sent a graduate student to Nolan's farm in 2021 to study the derecho damage pattern in the context of the shelter belt protection. The student, a young woman named Mei-Lin Chen, pursuing a master's in agricultural engineering, spent 3 months measuring wind damage at various distances from Nolan's tree lines. Her data confirmed what Nolan's gypsum blocks had suggested for 32 years. The sheltered zone showed 65% less stalk breakage, 40% less root lodging, and 56 bushels per acre more harvestable grain than the exposed zone on the same property. Mei-Lin's thesis was published in 2022. The abstract included a sentence that summarized 84 years of Joseph Sabetka's trees. Mature multi-row shelter belts provided substantial protection against catastrophic straight-line wind events, reducing yield loss by approximately 65% in the protected zone. The long-term yield benefit from moisture conservation and wind stress reduction, combined with the catastrophic event protection observed in this study, suggests that shelter belt maintenance represents a positive net present value investment over a 40-year horizon, despite the acreage opportunity cost. Positive net present value. The academic language for the trees paid for themselves. The math that the co-op had been getting wrong for 38 years. Corrected by a graduate student who measured what the co-op had been ignoring. Nolan read the thesis at his kitchen table. He didn't understand all the academic language, but he understood the conclusion. The trees paid for themselves. He'd known it since 1988, when his gypsum blocks started showing the moisture difference. He'd known it in his bones since 1962, when he'd taken over the farm from Frank, and Frank had told him the same thing Joseph had told Frank. The trees are the farm. The corn is what we sell. But the trees are what makes the corn possible. Don't cut them. Promise me you won't cut them. Nolan had promised. He'd kept the promise for 58 years. Let me tell you about how this ends. Nolan Sabetka is 82 years old. He still farms the 400 acres, with help from his son, Patrick, who came back from Des Moines in 2018, when his mother's health declined, and who stayed because the farm needed him, and because he'd realized, watching the Derecho damage from 100 miles away on television, that his father had been right about the trees, and that being right about something important was worth coming home for. Patrick maintains the shelter belts now, the pruning, the dead tree replacement, the fence row cleaning that keeps the wind channel open through the tree rows. He's replaced 11 cedars and 4 Osage oranges since 2020, trees that were damaged in the derecho, or that had reached the end of their lifespan after 84 years. The replacements are young, 6 to 10 feet tall, still growing, decades from maturity, but the existing trees stand. The cedar trunks are 18 inches in diameter. The Osage orange trunks are 24. The root systems extend 30 feet from each trunk, anchored in the same Iowa soil that Joseph Sabetka walked when he planted the seedlings in 1936, with a shovel and a conviction that the most important crop on a farm is the one that protects all the others. The Farmall 1206 that Nolan used for heavy field work sits in the barn. Patrick uses a newer tractor for planting and combining, but the 1206 does the tree work, dragging limbs, pulling stumps, hauling seedlings. The tractor that farms around the trees instead of through them. The farm journal, Frank's journal, continued by Nolan, soon to be continued by Patrick, sits on the kitchen table beside the gypsum block readings and Mei Lin Chen's thesis. 3 generations of observations about wind and moisture in trees, written in pencil, confirmed by science 84 years after a Czech immigrant decided that the wind was not something to ignore. Dale Novak's cedar seedlings are 5 years old now. They're 8 feet tall, waist-high windbreaks that couldn't stop a strong breeze, let alone a derecho. In 10 years, they'll be 20 feet tall and functional. In 20 years, they'll be 35 feet tall and serious. In 40 years, when Dale's grandchildren are farming his ground, they'll be 50 feet tall and doing what Joseph Sabetka's trees have been doing since 1936. Standing between the crop and the wind, silent, patient, absorbing the force that breaks everything it touches on open ground. The co-op doesn't joke about Nolan's trees anymore. Some of the men at the counter have planted their own. The conversation has shifted from Nolan's wasting 18 acres on firewood to how long until seedlings reach functional height. The answer, 15 to 20 years, is a number that makes farmers quiet, because 15 to 20 years is a long time to wait for something you should have kept instead of cutting down. Nolan doesn't say much about it. Never did. He drinks his coffee at the counter and listens to the conversation about seedlings and spacing and species selection, and he adds nothing because there's nothing to add. The trees are standing. The corn behind them stood. When everything else fell, the argument is over. The wind settled it. The jokes stopped in August 2020. The trees didn't. That's the whole story. Subscribe to The Average Farmer for more. We'll see you in the next one.